loud. Okay, now there we go. Okay, well, this is Ann Wright, and I am one of the organizers of our Dissent Voices of Conscience webinar with World Beyond War. And this is our fourth session. We've had some very, very good sessions. And in fact, I will show you a little bit because we kind of like to show people what, let's see, share, yeah, what we've been doing here. And this is our book, Dissent, Voices of Conscience, that we have authored. I'm one of the co-authors. And then Susan Dixon, who's here with us, is another one of the co-authors. Our publisher, Arne Cutler, is here. Oops. It's our book, as those of you all who've been on the webinar before have seen, has been translated into Japanese. And we have with us 4 people from Japan that are a part of this, including Hisai Ogawa, who is a coordinator of getting that book published in Japan. And we have back there, Dorothy Dofer, who was one of the people that translated it. And then we have 2 other people that are here from Japan and Okinawa that are on this. The book is about telling the truth, about whistleblowers telling the truth. And one of them who wrote the long prologue to our book is that we were very honored to get is Daniel Ellsberg. In our very first session, we had another person. I was one of the 3 that resigned in opposition to the war in Iraq back in 2003. And one of the people we had on in our first session was Brady Kiesling. We also talked about John Brown. He was unable to join us, but he was the second diplomat to resign. And then on that first session, oh, there I am again. We also had Aaron Watada, First Lieutenant Aaron Watada, who had refused to deploy to Iraq, calling it an illegal war. He was court-martialed, and the court-martial ended in a, what do you call it? Not a hung jury, but a mistrial. That's what it was. Our second session focused on whistleblowers and the government, civilian whistleblowers, including Colleen Rowley, who blew the whistle on FBI, refusing really to let field offices do more investigations of the people who turned out to be part of the 9/11 guys who hijacked the airplanes. She was one of the whistleblowers on the Time magazine Person of the Year in 2002 or 3. Also, we had Jesslyn Radak of the Department of Justice, a whistleblower in the case of the American Taliban, Johnny Walker Lynn. And she wrote a book called Canary in the Coal Mine. And we talked about Catherine Gunn, who was a whistleblower in the UK. She's the one that blew the whistle on both the US and the UK. They're spying on the United Nations about whether they were going to vote for invading and occupying Iraq. We also talked about Craig Murray, who is the UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, who talked about the Uzbeks boiling people, and the Uzbeks, the US had gotten to agree to using one of their airfields as a transit point for US military going into Afghanistan. Craig has been a truth teller on a variety of things, and he's now in 80 days, he's spending in a Scottish jail for a very circuitous way of identifying people who were on trial and acquitted of any charges. But Craig, as a blogger, is now spending 30 days or not 80 days in jail. Here's a picture of several of us whistleblowers with Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy when we went to visit him in London. Craig Murray is there, Brady Kiesling, Tom Drake, Colleen Rowley, Julian, Elizabeth Murray, Ray McGovern, Annie Mashad, and me over in the background. And there's a little picture of Julian that we remember, as he is still in prison right now in the UK under extradition possibilities to the US for espionage. Our session 3 dealt with military war resistors, and we had Jeff Patterson, who is a Gulf War I resistor and founder of Courage to Resist. And even though it says I am Bradley Manning, it's not, it's Jeff, but he was doing his activist work under Courage to Resist. We also had Kevin Benderman, who refused to go back on another deployment to Iraq. We also had Ricky Clausing, who went AWOL after he had returned to Iraq. He went AWOL for a year. Today, we're going to be talking with people about Guantanamo and Afghanistan, and the people, and one of the things that we'll be focusing a little bit on are, whistleblowers that have been charged with espionage, during the Obama administration. And one of our folks was John Kiriakou, but he wasn't convicted of it, but he was one of the ones that was charged with for whistleblowing, and they go after him on charges of espionage. So we'll ask John to talk about that. You'll talk more about exactly what got him in the government's eye. We'll be talking with James Yee, our Army Muslim chaplain, who got in deep water terribly for nothing. And then finally, we'll be with Matt Ho on issues of Afghanistan and his descent from Afghanistan. So that is kind of what we'll be doing today in terms of our program. And we thank everybody who's a participant in terms of our sessions. And this is the last one, although we certainly will be keeping in touch with you all. But we've really enjoyed having all of you with us during that period of time. And Susan, let me ask you to go ahead and talk more about the things that we have covered in the book on Guantanamo and other issues. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, so I have, as usual, lots of ideas. So I made some notes so I don't go too far off. But I guess today I was just thinking of general questions like, what do you do when your government makes it illegal to challenge or expose its own illegal practices or policies? And, or if your government retaliates against you for trying to work within the system to follow the rule of law, what choices do you have at that point when you feel like you need to follow your conscience? And then I kind of was wondering, even that idea of, is it even possible to hold your government accountable for abuses of power, given the constraints that are on so many people like this? And I was thinking about the military whistleblowers that we cover in the Dissent book, people who spoke out or leaked information. Most of them, or if not all, tried to work within the system and go through proper channels to see if they could correct what was going on. And many, like Jesselyn Wright talked about, she thought that once the illegal acts were revealed, then the government would take proper steps to remedy it. And that wasn't at all her case. And many of the other people we talked to and about have followed that same path. So these are often people who believe deeply in the system, who have these clear ideas of right and wrong and what they can and cannot do according to their own conscience. That idea of what does the US stand for and what should it stand for, and should these actually be the same? And then I was thinking about some of the quotes by people we had covered, things like people said, "I did not do anything dishonorable." Another said, "I'm not a criminal." Another said, "I've not deserted the military or been disloyal to my fellow soldiers." So it's a kind of flip side, because of the ways that whistleblowers or people who leak or speak out are basically their tarnished reputations and things like that, where they're presented as traitors or, spies or whatever it is. And then I was looking at some of the issues that were addressed by some of the people we covered in the Dissent book. Things like, should the Geneva Conventions apply to any people taken prisoner by the US. Another idea was about the language. So should prisoners be called enemy combatants so that they don't actually fit within the framework that we already have existing? Also redefining what constitutes interrogation or torture. So I was thinking about something Ricky said last week, Ricky Klausing said, and that whole idea, like, what if you become the things that you say, the very things that you say you're fighting? And he had left a quote on his bed when he went AWOL. And he said it was a similar vein to what Henry David Thoreau had said about, well, he sort of paraphrased, but he said, as soldiers, as Americans, and as human beings, we mustn't lend ourselves to that same evil which we condemn. So that idea of becoming what we're supposed to be fighting, or we say we're fighting. And then in this section of the book, we also focused on a large number of military generals and admirals who were speaking out by sending letters to President Bush, U.S. Armed Senate Committee. I said that wrong. Did I say that wrong? Armed Services Committee, sorry. And also possible the fact that Alberto Gonzalez was nominated to be the Attorney General, and Gonzalez had been the White House counsel up until that point, and he was the one, or one of the ones, who advised President Bush that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the conflict in Afghanistan. So one of the things that these military generals and admirals were covering was the importance of the US military operating within the rule of law, rather than the ways that they seem to be doing. And this again was a theme that we came across, like with Jesselyn and, well, several others. So in these letters, these military generals and admirals, they argued that the US detention and interrogation operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Guantanamo, and then other places like Black Ops sites. They said this has fostered greater animosity toward the US. So in some ways, like Anne spoke about several times, in fact, it would put the Americans in more danger. It's undermined our intelligence gathering operations. And it's also added to the risk facing US troops serving around the world. Because if we're not following Geneva Conventions and Americans are taken prisoner, then it's very likely that whoever's taking them prisoner will not also follow them, Geneva Conventions. So we covered in the book things like Abu Ghraib, the photos, and I talked in the first session about Joe Darby, who released the photos, but he didn't leak them. He sent them up the chain of command, and then Rumsfeld leaked that Joe Darby was the one who released the photos, and then Darby had to go into hiding and witness protection. So another person was the U.S. Army Sergeant Samuel Provence, and he was also at Abu Ghraib around the same time Joseph Darby was, and he spoke out on one of the main U.S. news channels about the abuses that were going on there. Another was a U.S. Army captain named Ian Fishback, and this was at a different prison in Iraq, but he wrote a letter to John McCain and was saying that, was talking about the abuses that he had witnessed in a prison near Fallujah. And then in Guantanamo Bay, I was thinking how prisoners that were held here were called the worst of the worst. And it just seems like such an irony. And you mentioned, I forget which session it was, but how the US bought most of the prisoners there, bought 95% of the prisoners there. So these were people who were turned in either purely for financial reasons, or financial reasons plus somebody had a grudge against them, or different things like that. So and many of the prisoners had no connection to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. So we also covered Matthew Diaz, who was a US Navy lawyer, and basically he got in trouble because he released to a group that was planning to represent these Guantanamo prisoners. They wouldn't, Rumsfeld said, and John Ashcroft, they were saying, you can't release the names to the people who are going to represent you. And yeah, exactly. And so Matthew Diaz said, that's insane. And he leaked the information. He leaked the list of names to the people who were going to represent the prisoners. And then he got in a lot of trouble for that. He was court-martialed and spent 6 months in jail. So in conclusion, I was thinking how often the more I learn about something, the more questions I have. And this morning I saw an opinion piece by Mary Kaldor. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She's a director of the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at the London School of Economics. And one of her takeaway lessons was, she said, the main lesson from Afghanistan is that the war on terror does not work. And I thought that's a really interesting one. And there are so many ways to look at that. But I was thinking in one way, she said the US allies in the fight, the warlords and corrupt officials would go on to undermine the legitimacy of the Afghan government. And that is most likely true. But also, I kept thinking like, well, did the war on terror work? And if it did, for whom? I was thinking about the ideas we said about nation building when we went in, about protecting the rights of women in Afghanistan. But then I was also thinking about something I said, I think last week about, in order to have peace, we need to remove the profit from waging war. And I was thinking about how endless war is a multi-trillion-dollar business, and how Congress gave $2 trillion to 5 US weapons companies during the war in Afghanistan. And then I was thinking about the idea of war on terror, war on drugs, war on poverty. Do these things work or not? And in what ways? And who defines that? And I remember a couple of decades, I heard Bill Moyer say something about some US states determine how much prison space they'll need by looking at 4th grade literacy rates. And you could look at that and you could say, well, let's try to increase the rate of literacy. But that's not the point, because once you learn that the US has a prison system that's for profit, it makes more sense in some ways that they're not interested in that. And also, if you can, there are racial biases within this as well, because if people who are felons can't vote, and often that kind of system is sort of targeted to Black people or people of color in general, who are then disenfranchised, not able to vote. And I was thinking that one other thing was George Kennan back in 1948. He worked for the State Department. He was the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff. He had a pretty high level position, and his quote from back then. And he got let go because he was too soft on these things. But he said we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we're going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we're hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. And from there, it also reminded me of a quote by Thomas Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow. And he said, if you can get people to ask the wrong questions, then the answers don't matter. And that's I just kept going around with these ideas, and that's what I would like to introduce. Oh, and you're muted.
Oh, good. Well, not for long. Thank you very much. Those were a real great overview of that section of the book that we had, and then weaving in so many other ideas about it. Thank you very much. And as Susan said, that part of our book where we talked about the military and the CIA and its torture policies, and how many senior level people, letters from generals, many generals saying to the Bush administration, you can't let this go on. And yet they did. And yet we did have whistleblowers, and the one that we'd like to have first, who ended up spending time in prison because he let the world know that the official policy of the United States was to torture people through waterboarding. And John Kiriakou, who had a long career in the CIA, who was on the staff of Senate committees, very well respected person in the government. The government went after him as he started speaking about whistleblowing. And they went after him big time. So John, we apologize as citizens for what our government did to you. And please give everyone a view of what happened.
Thank you so much, Ann. That's very sweet of you. Hi, everybody. My name is John Kiriakou. As Ann said, I am a former CIA officer and the former senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In 2007, I blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program in an interview with ABC News, with Brian Ross of ABC News. And in that interview, I said three things. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official US government policy. It was not the result of a rogue CIA officer, as President Bush had told the American people. And I said that the torture policy had been personally approved by the president. So, as you might imagine, the FBI began investigating me the very next day. They investigated me from December of 2007 until December of 2008, and then closed the case. They sent my attorneys a declination letter declining to prosecute me. A few weeks later, Barack Obama became president. John Brennan, an old nemesis of mine from the agency, became the number 2 at the National Security Council. And he asked the Justice Department to secretly reopen the case against me. They investigated me again. I had no idea that I was under investigation for the next 3 years. I had no idea that my phones were tapped, that my emails were being intercepted, that I was under periodic surveillance by the FBI. And then finally, in January of 2012, I was charged with 5 felonies coming out of that ABC News interview and a subsequent interview I gave to the New York Times. I was charged with 3 counts of espionage, 1 count of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1981, and 1 count of making a false statement. Now, I hadn't committed espionage, clearly, and those charges were eventually dropped. I'm still not sure exactly what the false statement charge was supposed to be, or what the false statement was that I allegedly made. My attorneys were never quite clear. And I ended up taking a plea to the Intelligence Identities Protection Act just to make the whole thing go away. What they did to me is what they do to most whistleblowers. Daniel Hale just recently got even a harsher version of this, but they came to me on the day of my arrest, and through my attorneys, they said that they were going to ask for 45 years in prison for speaking with ABC News and the FBI. I'm sorry, and the New York Times. But if I agreed to plead guilty to espionage right now, they would agree to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. And I said that I had done nothing wrong, and I didn't intend to spend 10 minutes in prison. That was on a Monday, the day of my arrest and arraignment. On Wednesday, they came back with 8 years. And on Friday, they came back with 5 years. And my attorney, who was a legendary figure in Washington, Plato Kacharis, had been a defense attorney going back to the 50s and handled some of the most important accused in Washington's history, including through the Watergate scandal. He said to me, I've been an attorney here for 55 years, and I've never seen them come down in time when they were making their offers. And I said, well, why would they do that? And he said very clearly, they have a shit case and they know it's shit. So we're going to trial, he said. Well, they didn't make any more offers for the next 10 months. And then they came back and said, 3.5 years, best and final offer. And if you don't take 3.5, we're going back up to 45. And so finally in this proffer meeting, I said, you know what? I said, I'm convinced of my innocence. I am convinced that blowing the whistle on a crime is not a crime. And so I want to go to trial, and I'm going to testify on my own behalf. And when I do that, I'm going to talk about some of the hideous crimes against humanity and war crimes that I witnessed in 15 years of counterterrorism operations at the CIA. And so they said, okay, 2.5 years, you do 2. Believe it or not, I decided to turn that down. My then wife and I stayed up all night long and looked at other cases, researched all night long, which really we had been doing for months anyway. And, there was only one other person in the history of the country that had been charged with violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. And she was an actual spy for the Ghanaian intelligence service. She was a CIA secretary sleeping with a Ghanaian intelligence officer, and she outed everybody in the CIA station. So they're comparing me with her. And I said, I'm going to turn it down. Well, I emailed my attorneys at 6 o'clock in the morning and I said, guys, I've been up all night and I've decided I haven't done anything wrong. I'm going to turn this down. One of them emailed me, the old timer, Plato Kacharis, and his exact words were, "You stupid son of a bitch, take the deal." And then one of the other attorneys said, "Put on a pot of coffee. We're on our way over to your house." They came over to the house and they said, "You don't understand how this works." And then the attorney that I liked and respected the most said, angrily, he said, "You know what your problem is? Your problem is you think this is about justice. And it's not about justice. It's about mitigating damage." He said, "It doesn't matter if you're innocent. If they want to get you, they're going to get you. And I'm telling you, as I would tell my own brother," he said, "take the deal." Well, one of the things that I had seen was a study that ProPublica had done. It was published in October or November of 2012. And it said in its conclusion that the federal government wins 98.2% of its cases. 98.2%. Now, when I was at the CIA and Saddam Hussein would win 95% in his re-election campaigns, we would laugh and we would say the fix is in and what a big joke this was. But the Justice Department wins 98.2% of its cases and we say they're all geniuses, or they only go after guilty people. That's just simply not true. What my attorney told me was true. This is not about justice. It's about mitigating damage. And so what do you do when you know that you have a 1.8% chance of winning? Do you take the 23 months or do you roll the dice and look at 45 years? The last question I had from my attorneys was, if I go to trial and I lose, realistically, what am I looking at here? And they said 12 to 18 years. Take the deal. And so I took the deal because I had 5 children at home.
Oh my God.
And I wanted this thing to just go away and I can get my life back again. And so that's what I did. Now, the funny thing is that when I got home from prison, I had only been home about 2 weeks. And 2 FBI agents called my attorneys and asked them to tell me that they were sorry, that this was a political case. They were ordered to do it, and it was just out of their hands. That's how Washington works. They're sorry. Please pass it on. And I said, you know what? No hard feelings. It's water under the bridge. I'm a big boy. And, there have been far bigger men than I who have had far more done to them and forgave their tormentors and moved on. And so, I wanted to do what Nelson Mandela did or Martin Luther King did and just forgive and move on. So that's what I did. Now, the funny part is I was a nobody, right? There was nothing special about me. I just happened to have some information about a crime that I saw committed. And I believed that the American people had a right to know what the government was doing in their name. And so the FBI and the Justice Department and the CIA and John Brennan made me a star. I was able to go on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and say that in the course of discovery, we found a memo from John Brennan to the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, saying, charge him with espionage. And Eric Holder wrote back and said, my people don't think he committed espionage. And John Brennan wrote, charge him anyway and make him defend himself. Well, you know what? I'm on the right side of history. And I know I am. And I can sleep at night. And my children respect me. So all in all, it was worth it. It was worth it. The only thing I would do differently is to consult an attorney like Jesselyn Radak, who specializes in whistleblowing before blowing the whistle. But otherwise, the American people have a right to know. The American people own this information. And they have a right to know what their government is doing. So thanks for listening.
Wow. Well, John, thank you very much. And
Thank
of
you, Ann.
course, we all, when all that was happening, I can remember so well. And just
Oh,
like,
you were there with
oh,
me, Ann.
man, it just
You and
heartbreaking.
Colleen and Raul and Jesselyn and Medea and Tom Drake, you guys were all there for me through the dark days.
Well, just trying to help, you know, people try, but boy, I tell you, as you said, when the government decides it's going to go after you, they pull out all the stops, and they were doing that. And that John Brennan jerk, geez,
He'll get his one of these days.
yeah,
He'll get his. And you know, this is another thing too, is the Justice Department spent $6 million to prosecute me. And
wow.
you have to ask, was society better off with me in prison? Was it worth spending $6 million of the taxpayers' dollars to prosecute me? Where are the controls? You know, where is the common sense? But it's not just me. I was just, you know, one of many. It was Tom Drake and Ed Snowden and Jeffrey Sterling and Daniel Hale and a whole cast of characters.
Indeed, the government has during the Obama, well, at the end of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and through the Trump administration, certainly the issue of using espionage is kind of, let's just throw that out against the wall, and then, you know, everybody has to defend against that. And it wasn't until, I mean, there were only 3 cases before. Who was the very first one that got charged? Was it Chelsea Manning that got charged with espionage?
Yeah, of the 8 of us under Obama, yeah, I think it was probably Chelsea was the first.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a tactic that they're using now. Well, there's another. Well, we'll open this up to everybody's questions after we ask all 3 of you all to speak. But another person that ended up that was with Guantanamo and then in jail is James Yee. And Susan, would you go ahead and introduce James?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ann. So James was a U.S. Army chaplain serving in the prison in Guantanamo Bay. And he was working with the prisoners there, and he raised questions about the treatment of the prisoners. And again, sort of similar to John's story, he was arrested, charged with espionage, aiding the enemy, possibly treason. Some of them were crimes punishable by death. So James, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor and pleasure to talk to everyone today. But in a short nutshell, I made my way back into the U.S. military in early 2001 as one of the first U.S. Army chaplains of the Muslim faith. Previously, I had served as an air defense artillery officer, a Patriot missiles fire control officer during the first Gulf, and it was around that time that I converted to Islam. Ended up leaving active duty, went overseas, did my religious work, and then came back to serve in what I thought would be a very unique opportunity and fill a void, a need that the U.S. military needed at the time, and that was chaplains of the Muslim faith, Muslim chaplains. And I came back in January of 2001, back on active duty. I'm a West Point grad, and it was just 9 months later, while serving my first duty assignment as a chaplain out at Fort Lewis, that the 9/11 attacks happened. And it was less than a year later that I was deployed to Guantanamo to be the chaplain to the prisoners. And at first, I knew I could play a definitive role because I had seen the media reports and the misunderstandings and the misconceptions that many of the service members and personnel at Guantanamo had, which caused a lot of conflict and turmoil just from not understanding Islam and the way of life of these prisoners being held in Gitmo. So I definitely felt that going down to Gitmo, I could help educate the command down there, help educate the Joint Task Force personnel so that they can do their jobs better in this detention operation. However, looking back in hindsight, I see that really that perhaps the purpose of me going down to Guantanamo or getting that assignment was so that the US government, so that the Pentagon could say that, oh, look, we've sent our Muslim chaplain down to Guantanamo to be a chaplain to the prisoners. And this is basically an indication that we're treating the prisoners humanely, that we're doing the right things, that we're looking out for the genuine welfare of the prisoners that we have detained here. But that wasn't the case. So I think it was kind of like I was being, in some sense, being used when I got that assignment. But nevertheless, I got the assignment. I went down there, and immediately I saw that the whole operation was pretty much chaos. The prison didn't even have a standard operating procedure. When in the military, we call them SOPs. There wasn't even an established standard operating procedure on how to run this detention operation. And actually, the unit that I was assigned to down in Gitmo, the guard force, we were tasked, one of our first assignments was being tasked to develop the SOPs. And I was responsible for developing the standard operating procedure for my role as a chaplain to provide religious support to the prisoners. And one of the interesting things is I ensured that when I authored my section, that the Geneva Conventions would dictate how I would operate in this environment, even though we were being told over and over and over that the commander-in-chief, President Bush, had said that the Geneva Conventions did not apply down in Guantanamo. And that was sending a signal to people down in Guantanamo that there perhaps might not really be any accountability in what goes on down here, and that the gloves were off, as some had stated, and that people could essentially do what they needed to do in order to get information which they thought would prevent the next 9/11 attack, which a lot of people fathom was already brewing, right? But when I authored my section, I ensured that I would be operating under, what I was trained under, the rules of Geneva Conventions, to treat prisoners humanely, and to act in accordance, even though that was not the official policy while we were down there. And actually, because of whistleblowers, WikiLeaks, you could actually go to WikiLeaks and go online and actually find now the first edition of the standard operating procedures that were leaked. And in that first edition, you can see how I authored my section, the religious support section, to ensure that I would be doing what's ethical, what's right. But to make a long story short, during my time in Guantanamo, I worked close in hand with the prisoners down there. I was in the cell blocks day in, day out. I saw the results, the effects, the consequences of the abuse and torture that occurred in Guantanamo, broken teeth, the bruises that prisoners often came back to the cell blocks with after going to interrogation. But what I tried to address most prominently was the religious persecution that was going on in Guantanamo, and how the operation, both the guard operation and the intelligence operation, was utilizing aspects of Islam in order to try and pressure prisoners, in order to psychologically torture the prisoners. And I often cite, simple examples, like when the news story hit about how the Quran was being desecrated in Guantanamo. That was kind of done in interrogation rooms to desecrate the Holy Quran in front of prisoners who were sitting shackled, you know, at the wrists, the waist, the ankles in a chair, while their interrogator would basically desecrate the Quran, would step on it, sit on it, kick it, throw it on the floor, etc., knowing that would anger and highly upset the prisoner, right? So that was the way that they would use religion. I often cite other examples in how prisoners would come back and tell me that they were, for example, forced to prostrate. Like in the Muslim prayer, we prostrate, we put our forehead to the ground in honor, in dedication of worshiping one God, right? But in Guantanamo, during some interrogation sessions, prisoners were often forced to prostrate in the form of the Muslim prayer in what was marked on the floor of that interrogation room, a satanic-like circle, a circle that had that satanic star symbol, and they would force the prisoner to bow down and prostrate in the center of this satanic circle while the interrogator would scream at that prisoner that Satan is your God now, not Allah, Allah being the Arabic word for God, right? So this is how religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo. And those are the kind of things that I, as the chaplain, tried to address. However, from what I was told, the intelligence gathering section, the interrogators, the people who were down there from CIA, FBI, Defense Intelligence Agency, military intelligence, felt that my addressing some of these abuses was hampering their mission to do their intelligence gathering job. So they had it out for me, and basically they came up with some plot that I was some kind of spy for the prisoners, and that I, along with some of the other translators who were very close to me in carrying out my duties as a chaplain, was called aspiring. And I was secretly arrested when I was coming back into the States from Guantanamo. I was held in secret at first, in prison, in solitary confinement. I myself at times found myself subjected to what's called sensory deprivation, where you had the blackened out goggles put on your eyes, the ear muffs over your ears. They didn't put a hood over my head like they did the prisoners at Guantanamo, but I understood what the sensory deprivation and when it was applied to meant. It meant that I also could be categorized as what they termed enemy combatant, a person who had no rights under the law in terms of how the U.S. government viewed the situation. So that was very frightening for me. I was thrown into solitary confinement down in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Consolidated Naval Brig, and that was the place where the U.S. government was also holding what they term U.S. citizen enemy combatants. There were two other U.S. citizens who were being held there as enemy combatants, one named Yasser Hamdi, who was formerly a prisoner at Gitmo, but when they learned that he was actually born in the U.S. when his parents were visiting the United States, they recognized that by birth he was actually a U.S. citizen. So he was taken from Guantanamo, put at the Consolidated Naval Brig down in Charleston. Then there was another a prisoner, Jose Padilla, if you remember that name. He was supposedly being suspected as an Al-Qaeda member who was going to set off a dirty bomb in the United States. He was a U.S. citizen, was also being held at that same prison. And then there was a third, Salah El-Mari, who was actually a legal resident in the United States, in Illinois. He was here legally attending college associated with Al-Qaeda. He was also being held. And then they put me in that same prison. And so the message was being sent that perhaps I too was being considered as an enemy combatant. And actually, I've always wondered whether or not that was the case. I have no doubt that it was. However, in some official statements later on, like from the Rumsfeld office, when SecDef Rumsfeld was asked about my case, he said that that officially that my case never actually made it to his desk. I don't believe that for a moment. And when I was first visited by my attorney, who I would later retain, Eugene Fidel, who I think is perhaps the nation's foremost expert in military law, had many connections, was told me on his first visit to me in the prison that my name was included, that my case was included in the president's daily intel brief. So I was in that prison, and the initial charges that were brought against me were spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny, and sedition. Those four offenses, of course, all carry the death penalty, are capital crimes, especially during a time of war. And then there was a fifth charge levied at me, which was failure to follow a general order. In the end, all the charges and accusations that were brought against me were dropped legally. My record was wiped clear. I was sent back to Fort Lewis. I was reinstated. However, at that point, I wanted to speak out, but I was immediately put under a military gag order, which prevented me from speaking publicly about my ordeal and what I experienced at Guantanamo and what I knew. So I left the U.S. military, got an honorable discharge, even received a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for exceptionally meritorious service. But what I didn't get was an apology. I never received any apology from anyone in any official capacity, and went on to author a book about my experience entitled "For God and Country: Faith and Patriotism Under Fire," and exposed all that I could about what I experienced in Guantanamo, how prisoners were treated, the religious persecution, and whatnot. What's very scary is that even in the most recent days, I've learned of things that happened in Guantanamo that I wasn't even aware of. For example, recently the movie The Mauritanian came out.
Right.
About Mohamedou Salahi, who was a prisoner at Gitmo during the time I was there. I was always under the impression that waterboarding didn't actually occur in Guantanamo. But after seeing the movie and seeing what was depicted and having recent communications with Mohamedou Salahi, the former prisoner at Gitmo, I now know that a form of waterboarding actually did occur in Guantanamo. And that was depicted in the movie when they took Mohamedou out onto a speedboat into the Guantanamo Bay. And as they sped around the Guantanamo Bay, they bent him over the side of the boat and forced his head into the water. So his head was totally submerged in water while they were speeding around in the speedboat. And of course, he felt like he was going to drown. And so in my view, that is a form of waterboarding. And that is something that I only learned of within the last couple of months since that movie came out, and since talking to Mohamedou on that experience. So that's very scary that even today I'm learning of the type of torture that was carried out at Guantanamo. But all the charges were dropped. I was released, and I left active duty, and one of the main reasons was so I could then speak out about the abuses at Gitmo and campaign to help close Guantanamo. And my post Guantanamo experience actually led me down the road to support President Obama, then Senator Obama, when he was running for president, because I felt as a constitutional law expert, he was the guy that could close Guantanamo. And it was a strong part of his campaign that he was going to close Guantanamo. He was going to ban torture. He was going to rid us of the failing military commissions, the war crimes tribunals that are still being carried out 20 years later in Guantanamo. And I supported him and was actually elected in Washington State as one of the national delegates pledged to Obama back in 2008. But 4 years later, when he ran for re-election, my views with his promise to close Guantanamo and him failing at that, and then even throughout his whole administration was not able to close Gitmo. And what do we have today? We still have 39 prisoners who are still in Guantanamo. Guantanamo is still open. And now the ball really falls in President Biden's lap as he was Obama's vice president at that time.
James, let me stop you right there for a few moments, if I may, and then we'll come back and we can discuss further what should happen to Guantanamo. We thank you so very much for that description. I remember meeting you, I think, for the first time at one of the Veterans for Peace conventions, and in 2005 or 6, I believe it was. And you've been a stalwart speaker for the truth on what has been going on in Guantanamo. And we'll come back, and you all will have a chance to ask John and James. And well, this kind of sounds like the Bible, John and James and Matthew. Our next speaker is Matthew Ho. And Matt Ho was in the U.S. military also. He was a Marine, a captain, 2 tours in Iraq. He was in Afghanistan as a State Department official and resigned against the policies that were going on in Afghanistan. And this was 10 years ago he resigned. So Matt has been very, very vocal in his disagreement with how the U.S. Has stayed in Afghanistan. And I know he's probably without a voice right now because he's been doing so many interviews on Afghanistan. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and explain what all happened with you, please?
Thank you, Ed. And well, it's been 12 years, 2009 when I resigned, and unlike James or John, I feel a little bit silly sitting here with these guys because I didn't really pay any consequences such as going to prison, or the full weight of the U.S. government destroying my life. The U.S. government certainly did things to hurt me, to discredit me, to make my life uncomfortable, but I never had to go through the ordeal and suffering that John and James went through, and their families went through by extension. I can't imagine what their families went through. And I think it's curious about that too. It's because if any of the 3 of us did anything that warranted going to prison, it would be me for voluntarily taking part in these wars for so long, being criminally complicit with them. So I know there are a lot of veterans who go through what's called moral injury who feel that way, that if we were put in prison, if somehow justice could occur for what we had done over there, then maybe things will be better for us. Because that's one of the issues I think a lot of veterans go through. Well, I shouldn't say I think, I know a lot of veterans go through is basically coming home and accepting what occurred over there and not being able to do anything about it, right? Not being able to ask for forgiveness, not being able to atone. None of us have time machines, and we feel guilty. We feel guilty for different things because we didn't save someone who was a friend of ours, because we shot and killed somebody, on and on and on, right? I mean, so long point to say, I'm very humbled to be here with John and James. I'm going to put in the chat, because I know we're running long here. I'm going to put in the chat a link to an essay I wrote last month or 2 months ago after Senator Mike Gravel died, because what he said in the presidential debates of 2008 had an impact on me. So just to kind of summarize, as Ann said, I was in both the wars. I was in the Iraq War twice. I worked on Iraq operations and policy in the Pentagon, the State Department. Then I went to Afghanistan in 2009. By the time I got to Afghanistan in 2009, I was intellectually and morally broken. All the rationales that I kept giving to myself for participating in these wars would just be struck down by one episode of reality after another. Right. So when I first go to the Iraq War in 2004, I'm thinking to myself, well, I mean, this all seems really pretty messed up. Yeah, we haven't found any weapons of mass destruction. I got there April of 2004. So but I can make a difference as an individual, right? And then when you realize that's not true, then it goes on to, well, if I stay in here long enough, then when I get to a senior level, then I can make a difference, right? I mean, you keep, when I took a company of Marines to Iraq in 06 and 07, it was, I'm a better officer than a lot of guys I know, and I could bring these kids home. You know what I mean? So you're constantly adjusting. And one of the things that helped me with that was my alcohol use, was the use of alcohol as medication. And I really do think, as I've been asked about this a lot over the last year, because Afghanistan is now back in the headlines and people have been asking me, and I've been forced to think about it and speak about it. I really do think that my resignation, in protest of the escalation of the Afghan war in 09 had a lot to do with the fact that I wasn't drinking over there. Back home, I was using alcohol to medicate. It was a slow way of killing myself, but it was also a way to kind of keep the weeds from growing in my brain, right? That intellectual and moral honesty, that was a way to keep it chained down, keep it subjugated, keep it behind bars. You get to Afghanistan, you can't drink anymore. And I really think the lack of that substance had a major effect on my, intellectual and moral honesty, arguing with myself. And as I went through the war, I was there for 5 months. I was all around the country. I was in a pretty senior position, even for someone who was, mid 30s. The same things I saw in Afghanistan were the same things I'd seen in Iraq. So after several events, after being encouraged by certain people, one by the column that Bob Herbert wrote in the New York Times about the death of Robert McNamara that summer, an email I got from my father, on and on and on. And of course, all the things that you're witnessing, taking part in, and seeing just weighs on you. I resigned in protest in September of 09. The first question, it's interesting because it went around, I sent my resignation in, and it went around the embassy in Kabul, went around the country, and then went back to Washington, D.C. And my ex-girlfriend, at the time, worked for Richard Holbrooke, who was the special representative for Afghan and Pakistan for the President of the United States at that time. And she emails me on this Monday morning. I sent my resignation letter in on a Friday afternoon. Liz emails me on a Monday morning. I've really not heard anything about that. And she's like, holy shit, Richard Holbrooke just came into this meeting and is yelling about who is this Matt Ho guy, and not long after I read Liz's email, I get a phone call from the States, on my little Afghan Nokia cell phone in Afghanistan. And it's from the guy who hired me for this job, a guy named Henry Ensher, who's got an interesting backstory we don't have time to get into on Henry. But Henry at this point is the director of Afghanistan operations for the State Department. The first thing he says to me about my resignation letter is, are you going to go to the media? Nothing. I mean, and at that point, hadn't even considered. I was quitting just to be done, and then as it goes on, as I said, the letter went around, Carl Eikenberry, who's the ambassador in Afghanistan, says to me, if you stay, I will write the introduction to this letter when you leave next year. The deputy ambassador says, I have children who are military age. No way I would let them fight in this war. My counterparts in the 6 other most violent provinces in Afghanistan, where I was in one of the 6 or 7 most violent provinces in Afghanistan, in Helmand, Kandahar, Nuristan, Nangarhar, Kunar. I think that was it. They all say to me, we completely agree. And this is what I hear over and over again. No dissent from what I'm saying. Nobody is saying, dude, you're an idiot. No one's disagreeing. Guys and men and women are saying to me things like, I wish I could do what you did. However, I've got 2 kids going to college in a few years. I end up going home. I have to go meet with Ambassador Holbrooke in the up in New York City, and he says, I agree with at least 95% of what you're saying. The British counterpart to Holbrooke says the same thing, and so it goes, right? Well, why? How come no one else is doing anything?
Yeah.
I basically have a month before anything really happens. I'm just sitting in my apartment, growing more and more angry about it. And one night I'm sitting next to, because I don't have a television because all my stuff is still in storage and the State Department hasn't sent it back to me yet. So I'm at a bar and watching Monday Night Football. And the guy next to me is a Washington Post editor. And I had, I told him my story. He told me who to call at the Post the next day. Here we are 12 years later. The effect that it had, and that my dissent was utilized by elements of the U.S. government, including Richard Holbrooke's office, is something I think that's unique. Not a lot of other whistleblowers have that. I had the support of people within the U.S. government who agreed with me and who liked seeing me on CNN today. I also caught the U.S. government by surprise, because I don't think they thought anyone was going to pay attention to this. I was on television constantly. I was on the Today Show, on Fareed Zakaria, I was on Judy Woodruff, et cetera, et cetera. And it gets to the point after a couple of weeks, though, I start hearing from these producers about, whether it be newspaper editors or television producers, radio producers, that they are getting messages contesting my validity. That a strategic communications firm that works for the Army Central Command, General Petraeus's command in Florida, is saying that I am misstating who I am. I did not have the experience over there. All kinds of stuff. At one point, it's even suggested to a television producer that I had gone to Afghanistan with the intent of resigning in protest, just so I could become a celebrity, an anti-war hero, and I guess, make, tens of dollars, right? Free cups of coffee, which is about what you get when you do something like this. So, it was interesting seeing all the lengths that they went to discredit me. They put up a fake Wikipedia page. And I know they were doing this and they were successful in it. The story I tell, because I think it's most salient, is about Dan Rather. And Dan Rather has me up to New York City. At that point, I think the name of the show was Dan Rather Reports, like an hour-long program he had on some cable network, 10, 12 years ago. And Rather interviews me for 3 hours. We're walking around Manhattan, doing B-roll, and he says to me, I know you're right about Afghanistan because I've been going there for 3 decades. Right before I leave, his producer comes up and says, hey, we just got this message, like the message I was describing. Basically, in summary, the message says, if this is the kind of person you want to work with, you're not the kind of people we want to work with. And what happens 3-4 weeks later, when Dan Rather Reports, that episode airs, I'm nowhere to be seen, but Rather is interviewing generals. I believe he was in Afghanistan, or one of his people was in Afghanistan, flying around in helicopters with General McChrystal. So just kind of an idea of how the US government will put pressure on the media to silence these things, even going so far, again, as to hiring firms to discredit you to. And I know that the other reason why I know they did this is because I met the guy who runs that strategic communications firm, a guy named Duncan Boothby. He comes up to me at a Christmas party in December 2009 at the Army Navy Club in DC, introduces himself and says, I just want to let you know I'm the guy who's been discrediting you to American media, right? So like that kind of thing. And it has an effect, because after that, after this campaign really gets underway, I am no longer able to go on any programs. A lot of programs I'm dropped from, but I'm not able to go on any programs without somebody to balance me. And who do they have on to balance me? They have on people like Michael Hanlon, who has a legitimate personal relationship with General Petraeus, who has written voluminously in support of the wars. He's been wrong all the time. And more importantly, I think most importantly, this neutral figure works for an organization that receives millions of dollars a year from the US government, from the fossil fuel companies, from the weapons companies, et cetera. So just wanted to in the time we have here, explain to you that besides the imprisonment, which, James and John, the personal attacks, the US government will also pressure the media not to discuss this, not to talk about it, that you will lose access, and it can be very effective. I do not believe that if I had resigned, say 2 years ago, that anyone would ever heard my name. I think the media landscape has changed that much in 10 or 12 years for the worse, that a dissent like that would not receive any type of, it would receive a minor amount of attention, I should say, rather than the mass attention that I got. And the one thing I will say is that some of the reason why, I purposely hedged. One, when I came back, I wasn't, the idea of publicly dissenting wasn't on my mind. Again, I was quitting just to quit because I was morally and intellectually broken. But after I did dissent, I had it in my head for the first year or 2 years that somehow I would go back into the government. So I hedged what I said. I tried to be as much a realist as possible. I did not bring into my discussions the moral and spiritual aspects that are so important to these wars, so important to the failures of these wars, so important to why the United States is the country it is now, because I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted to be a realist. And that all changed when Ray McGovern, I met, I guess you all probably, most of you know Ray McGovern, a former CIA officer, used to brief George H.W. Bush in the White House, you know. I meet him for coffee in DC, and we're finishing up. He says, "What are you doing now, Matt?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Well, come with me." And I said, "Okay, what the hell are we gonna be doing?" And we go, and this is the spring of 2011, the United States and NATO are bombing Libya. And there's a Code Pink protest outside of the White House. And I had never taken part in that thing because I'm serious, right? Because I'm a realist, I'm serious. I'm part of the foreign policy establishment. I can't be associated with these lefties, with these peaceniks, with these, you know, et cetera. And as soon as I got there, and excuse me for the language, but it's been a while. It's been a long week or two, and I really just don't have the energy to self-censor anymore. But my thoughts were, holy shit, these are the people I should have been hanging out with and trying to impress and wanting to be a member of all this time. And two things about, and I believe Ann was there, but Medea was there, Diane Baker was there. I mean, I'm sure others were there, but there are two things about them that made me realize that my ideas of somehow going back into the government, of wanting to be included in it, et cetera, were just false, were just tragic and terrible. Was the first was that these people, these women, knew what they were talking about to a degree better than almost anyone else in DC, by far. And secondly, they were also speaking from their experiences, from their hearts, from their values, from a moral, religious, spiritual place that was absent in, you know, the dark heart of the American empire, Washington, D.C. So, you know, I don't think I've ever talked about that, but as I've had these times to reflect about it, I've thought about that, Ann, about being there with you guys. And it was probably March or April 2011. And that effect it had on me, that kind of slap in the face, right? And okay, and it gave up. That really was a big milestone for me, giving up any desire to want to be part of what I once been part of. But I appreciate this chance to speak to you all. And yeah, again, it's such an honor to be on with James and John. And this is really a terrific little discussion group here.
Well, thank you, Matt. And I appreciate your last remarks, because when I resigned in 2003, it took me a while to decide that I would not be known as still known as a former government official, but that I would kind of throw my plight in with groups that you kind of went, oh my goodness, like in 2004 for the elections, Code Pink was at Boston for the Democratic Convention. That's where I first met them through the Veterans for Peace Convention in Boston, right during that convention, the political convention, and then 2 weeks later in New York City. And Medea and Gail Murphy had said, "Ann, you ought to come down to New York City, because that's really where the action's going to be, because we're going to go after the Republican Party like you have never seen. We're going to have so many women out there in pink slips, because we're going to give Bush the pink slip." And it was like, I'm not about to wear a pink slip. I just spent 35 years in the US government. I do not wear pink slips out on the streets. And so I understand what you said about, you know, moving over from positions in the government to more positions of really challenging, and certainly Code Pink is one of the groups that uses color and crazy stuff to get people's attention. And I know both James and John have been a part of a lot of demonstrations too. And I think for all of us that have been in the government, that making that step out is a big one, but once you've done it, you know, that's it. You're a part of a new community that's a really great community. And I know that our group here has lots of questions. So let me, everybody that has a question, if you'll raise your hand or put that little yellow thing up, and I'll ask 3 or 4 people to go ahead and give their questions, and then you all, the 3 of you, can evaluate it and answer any part of any one of them that you want to. So the first one, Rain, why don't you go ahead, and welcome to you. We're glad to see you.
Oh, thank you so much. As I said in my mail, I got my book late. Matthew Ho, everyone that has appeared on this show, thank you so much. My father, Jim Burroughs, did a documentary called Shadow of Afghanistan. I think it came out in 2006. He was telling me, Rain, the Americans are crazy to go after the Afghanistans. They will never win. And but anyway, it's a film called Shadow of Afghanistan, and I went to Afghanistan, but it was just to deliver a film. I didn't get to stay there. But thank you, everyone, for your witness. Thank you for risking jail time and doing jail time. I love you all, and that is all. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rain. David, how about you?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to, in regard to what Matthew Ho said at the end around the closing of space over the years, as far as dissent, I just wanted to mention I work for the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, which is the largest, has the largest number of employees in the state of Washington. And it's about Olympia, Washington. The capital is not far from Joint Base Lewis-McChord. We just got an all-staff email from the acting secretary of the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services that basically reminds us in very patriotic language about the great service of our soldiers in Afghanistan, and that there's no one that served there who can be seen in any dishonorable light, and that we should watch the way that we talk about this among our coworkers. That was reinforced by another email from the personnel service within our state. I mean, Joint Base Lewis-McChord, of course, is the home of the kill teams. I just find it really interesting that yes, I see what we did in Afghanistan as being incredibly dishonorable in terms of the conduct of the war, and in many regards, put it as high or as low on the chain of command as you want. But, you know, and yes, we may have some obligation to people in Afghanistan, but to say that we here have to fall in line with, you know, silence around this and just act in a humanitarian capacity towards Afghans here, maybe forgetting about those there still. I don't know what they're suggesting, but I wanted to know what you think about the environment here within the country right now around really the war and the end of the war, the retreat.
Okay, thank you, David. And then we'll go to Steve. And then are there any other questions? I don't really, okay, Virginia, we'll do those 4 and then hand it over to the 3. So Steve, go ahead. Steve, go ahead. You may be muted.
Okay, sorry about that, Ann. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So Matthew, I saw you on Dr. Democracy Now! Last week. That was a great interview you did with Davy Goodman. And I'm really glad you stressed something, because I think there's a narrative that Biden is almost like a peacenik, which is completely kind of like ridiculous. And I'm glad you pointed out that he really didn't really oppose the surge at all. He eventually decided for like 10,000 less troops than Obama did back in the surge of 2009, 2010. So I think that's really important. And I think getting back to the media landscape, I first heard about you back in 2009 when none other than Rachel Maddow had you on to discuss your resignation. And it seems like you fast forward 12 years, Kiriaka mentioned Brennan earlier. Like I told Jesslyn a couple weeks ago, there's this thing where the progressives are almost slowly siding with the intelligence community. And I don't really think Rachel Maddow's a big deal, but that's just kind of like emblematic of how you said the media is actually getting worse, where there's no more anti-war voices that are allowed, even on MSNBC. So maybe if you could speak to that.
Okay, thank you. And Virginia, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd just like to say thank you to all of the men who spoke tonight, and also to apologize. I'm really sorry that you had to go through that for all of us. I have to say that this series has very disheartened me and disturbed me. And Guantanamo has disturbed me from the very beginning because it always was to me against American values. And I just can't understand why it is still open. What can we do to get it closed?
Okay, thank you. And next one we'll have Dorothy.
Yes, Dorothy. It's a kind of change of topic, but I wanted to talk about Catherine Gunn's book. Catherine Gunn. It was in English, and also there was a DVD called Official Secrets, starring Keira. What's her name? Knightley. Keira Knightley. What I want to say on this point is that if ever people are interested in getting books translated or something like this, like Anne's book, Dissent, Voices of Conscience, we translated into Japanese. But if you want to do that, like I was considering doing this for The Spy Who Tried to Stop a War. That's the Catherine Gunn book. Nothing happened because, first of all, before you attempt something like that, you have to get permission from the person who owns the copyright. But once it's published, most of the time, the authors who have the first legal chance to keep the copyright, they kind of sell it to the big companies. And then if you try to get in touch with the big companies, going to one company or the other company, and then you run around in circles basically, and it's really hard to get a contract to translate a book just because you think it's important to being translated like into Japanese from English. So if any of you write books in the future, be careful if you sell your book to a big company or something like that, to keep your translation copyrights as your own, so that if some people like Hisaya and I, who are not famous authors, we are just English teachers at universities who speak many languages, and we're capable of doing that. But if you as the author relinquish your right to the copyright, it's harder to get it translated by people like us who don't get money for doing this and who have to find a publisher who's willing to not to invest their own money in publishing it. Then you relinquish the chance to work with people who have similar views to you. So keep your copyrights is what I'm saying. That's all.
Thank you, Dorothy. Well, you all
Okay.
did a super job on the translation of the parts of Dissent, and we really thank you very much for that. So we've had several comments and we've had a couple of questions. So let me go to our fine folks that have told us their stories today for their comments. And John, would you like to start for final comments?
I think we lost John. Man.
Okay, then James, how about you? Would you like to make any comments toward last comments and any questions or such? Let's see, James, you may be muted.
Right.
Here you go.
Yeah, just one of the questions I heard was what can be done to close Guantanamo? That's a great question, and I'm not sure at this point whether we can close Guantanamo. One of the things that's been done is that the number of prisoners has been whittled down from over 800 to now only 39. And that seemingly has taken Guantanamo out of the dialogue, national dialogue, and out of the conversation, to a point where I think that was part of the plan, to get the numbers of prisoners down, where it wouldn't be a concern of the majority of the American people. And unless the majority of American people take an interest in Guantanamo and are against Guantanamo being still open. I'm not sure if anything else at this point will work to close Guantanamo. It really is going to take the people, and unfortunately, the situation is many people today actually believe Guantanamo has been closed after President Obama promised to close it, and then in his second day of office signed that executive order where he was going to close it within 1 year. Many people actually believe he followed through on that, and that Guantanamo was closed. And you can't imagine how many people I come across that say, "Oh, President Obama closed that place, didn't he?"
Well, James, and thank you. There are a lot of groups that are still working to try to close Guantanamo. Every January, we have a big gathering in Washington, D.C. in front of the White House and then going to Congress. So there still are groups that are putting pressure on the administrations, and I can put the links to those in the last final email that we send to everyone about having been on with this book club. Matt, how about closing comments and any addressing any of the ideas that any of the participants have made? Thank you.
Well, first, thank you for that advice, Dorothy. I'll keep it in mind if I ever, get around to finishing what I've tried to write. I think one of the things that you find with people who have been whistleblowers, dissenters, truth tellers, is that two things. One, they're made an example of. And I just heard someone the other day say, with the 45-month sentence that Daniel Hale got, the U.S. government just stopped, another 1,000 Daniel Hales, right? That making an example out of people. You saw this with, I think, this past week, or the State Department. There was a State Department cable leaked where, these State Department officers in the Kabul embassy said, "Hey, no, we said this was going to happen. Like, we were warning about this." And Secretary of State Blinken's response was to remind them about the Dissent channel, which, if anyone knows anything, that's just a crock. But the Dissent channel. But what I think you can read through that when they bring up things like that is like, this is your one warning. Don't do it again. Just do not speak out. You've been warned. We will make an example out of you. And the other thing is that other people don't want to help or support or trust you. And there's a great and I've heard this not just from national security whistleblowers. I have a friend who works at MSNBC who's done a lot of work with whistleblowers in general. She did a lot of work with TSA agents who are whistleblowers. And she says, all you guys end up the same. You all have familial problems, relationship problems, money problems, on and on and on. And one of that is just because we're pushed outside the group, and purposefully. And, there's a scene from, if you guys remember the the TV series Mad Men. And at some point during that show, it's about an advertising executive in New York City in the 1960s, and he decides he's no longer going to represent cigarette companies, and puts in the story in the show, puts a big ad in the New York Times. We agree with the doctors. We are not going to represent cigarette companies. We believe in people's health, et cetera, et cetera. And he gets a big award from the American Heart Association. And he and his friend are about to go to the big award ceremony. And he says, "Oh, hang on a second. I need to go back to my office. I need more business cards." And his friend says, "What do you need those for?" He says, "Well, I'm going to be at this award ceremony. I'm getting a big award. I'm the American Heart Association Man of the Year." And he says, "Yeah, everybody wants to give you an award. No one's going to hire you. You're not a yes man. You make everybody scared." So there's that. I think that a lot of whistleblowers and truth tellers and dissenters go through, is that, people don't want to hire people like that. People don't trust, because this person is he's tied, he or she is tied to their integrity and their values and their principles. That's not who I want to hire. But, I think that gets to the point about that's brought up in a couple of questions about the media and about, in general, just about the environment in this country. And I think we really do have a serious problem. You can best look at our corporate media, particularly our television media, as either team red or team blue. And that's the way it's determined. I used to be on MSNBC quite a lot up through 2012, and my last appearance was 2014. And I can tell you quite clearly the reason I'm no longer on there is because I am not a member of Team Red or Team Blue. You are seeing some anti-war voices on some of the networks. I believe Phyllis Bennis got on with Lawrence O'Donnell. Lawrence O'Donnell is about the best one time. Lawrence O'Donnell is about the best on these in terms of CNN, and MSNBC is about the best, and Fox is a whole different animal. They'll have people on, but the same way too, MSNBC and CNN now does on people who are, say, pro-withdrawal. They are only on, or they are mainly on, if they are presenting their argument in a pro-Biden sort of way, right? So you'll see that a lot with does it, even you might be saying something that's anti-war or anti-empire or pro-human rights or what have you, but it has to fit in that Team Red and Team Blue perspective. And I think that's very damaging. I think it allows for so many people to be misinformed, and the misinformed US public is a danger to the world, because that allows things like these wars to occur. That allows climate change. I just had somebody the other day told me they believe that the United States is not only not the largest polluter in the world, right? But is like the 53rd polluter in the world, because that's what they heard on Fox News. I mean, like, so even things that are demonstrably true, we have statistics and details and numbers, and we could say, yes, this is the biggest, that is the most. Even that information doesn't really reach people. And there is a woman I would urge you to follow. She works for the Columbia Journalism Review now. She used to work for MSNBC. She quit last year. She resigned actually from MSNBC as a matter of conscience because of the ratings-based news system. And her name is Ariana Pekary. It's Arina Pekary, Pekary. She's at Columbia Journalism Review now, but follow her on Twitter or whatnot. And she provides a lot of perspective on our news industry, particularly our cable news industry, that an insider like her can provide. And I think it's worse than we imagine, because of all the incentives that are in place at these networks, whether they be institutional or individual, that journalism is not what they're reaching for. So, Ann, I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Matt and James and John, for your stories and for your courage and for what you've had to go through to tell the truth about what the U.S. government is doing. And that's why we wrote the book Dissent, taking the profiles of several people, many people, and the stories until 2007 and 8. And there's so many out there. We want to thank all of you all who have signed up for this World Beyond War book club. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. We've been through 4 sessions of it, and it's been an opportunity for us to get to know each other a little bit, and for you all to get to know some people that have been pretty darn courageous with all of the things that they've been doing. I want to ask Susan Dixon, as a co-author of Dissent, to have some closing words, and then we'll wrap this up. Susan, go ahead.
Thanks, Ann. I just wanted to say, pretty much echo what Ann said. Thank you so much for including us in your book series, and to all the speakers we've had. I just feel really fortunate and inspired by so many people in Virginia. I understand what you were saying too. It's like disheartening to hear a lot of these stories. And sometimes I would get kind of just really overwhelmed and everything. And one of the things that actually helped me the most was talking to Ann, because even though she works with some of the darkest things, she's also one of the most kindest, most uplifting humans I've ever met in my life. So in some ways, I feel like if you can find a community of people who are kind of like that, it really is inspiring. And even I'm trying to think which one. Oh, when Ricky was saying last week about Kevin Benderman being the inspiration, or a huge inspiration for him to resign. or go AWOL. I think it's kind of like that as well, kind of like a chain where we can all kind of uplift each other. And there are some really good people, you know, yeah. My short version is thank you to everyone for including us.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you for piling through all of the materials, and Arnie Cutler, our publisher, who went through so many materials with us to try to figure out how we could put this massive information about men and women, military and civilians, who had publicly spoken out against the policy, starting with Afghanistan and then Iraq, Guantanamo, so many elements of what we have been dealing with over the last 20 years. And our book only covered, you know, the first 8 years really of that, of 7. And now we've had another 14 years, almost double the time. And there are so many other people that are out there that are whistleblowers, and they need support. Their families need support. We're not really too good about that. We can help people, or we seem to help people, you know, when they're going through the court martial or the trial or whatever. But then while they're in prison, and then when they get out, we as the community we need to keep supporting them through this, because as I think it was John said, you know, it was a very difficult time for him and for his family, and they go after it. Tom Drake, who lost his job as a senior executive of the National Security Agency for blowing the whistle on a redundant program that was going on. He has never been able to get a job, and he was one of the most senior people in the NSA. He sells Apple computers at an Apple store now. No one will hire him. And as Matt said, you're kind of left out there by yourself. And I feel very, very thankful that I fell into this crazy group of activists who really try to keep people positive and trying to do something to change what our government is doing. And it doesn't really matter who's in charge. I mean, actually it does, but all of them have, you know, have things that we have to watch them for, because they do lie and they do shade the truth. And when we see this going on, we need to support the whistleblowers. So we thank you all so very much for being with us as we have talked about DISSENT, Voices of Conscience. And we thank you for supporting World Beyond War. And the next book that will be in the book club will be Bending the Arc. And one of our participants here, Maureen Amon, is the co-author of that, the co-editor of that. And it'll be a very, very good book club. So with that, we want to thank you all so very much. And I will put on the screen one more time, since I did put this slideshow together, I want to use it. So just to go through all of the people that we have been able to talk with during this period of a month that we've had 4 sessions of DISSENT, Voices of Conscience, to remember these folks and to know that there are lots more out there that we want to be able to help in any way that we can, and to support whistleblowers and to support the families that go through so much. So we've got a lot of people that we're working with and want to keep in our thoughts and in our minds. The whistleblowers that we see here of Thomas Drake, Stephen Jin Woo Kim, James Hittensberger, and some of these I don't even know. I mean, this is so interesting. I haven't heard of these. Shamsi Lebowitz, John Kiriakou, we do know. Bradley Manning, we know. Jeffrey Sterling, Ed Snowden, Daniel Hale. Yes, we know those, but some of the other ones, I must admit, I don't know. John Kiriakou, James Yee, pardon me, James. Matthew Ho. And before Obama, only 3 people had been charged with espionage: Daniel Ellsberg, Samuel Loring Morrison, and Lawrence, I've got to push this over so I can see it, Franklin. So with that, we want to thank you again for your presence on our webinar. And
And
we'll
there's one I don't think that was on that list. There was William Binney, who was one of the architects of the NSA SIGINT program, was also targeted.
well targeted, but he hasn't been charged with espionage. There are a lot of people that have been targeted, but we know Bill very well. And John certainly does know. But I want to thank you all very much, and we will send out a final message to you with the link to the video, the recording on this. And please feel free to use all of these videos. That's what they're for, is to try to help educate our communities on what's happening. So again, we want to thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.